TipTut.
Hello everybody and welcome back to TipTut. Today we're taking a look at how to create that glitch effect that you just saw in the opening. This may look slightly complicated, but don't worry, it is very simple. There's a little bit of typing of code and there's a little bit of adjustment layers and things like that. Apart from that, it's really simple. So let's just dive right in. First thing you're going to want to do is obviously create a new composition. I'm going to call this one tutorial. 1920, 1080, 30 frames per second, about 15 seconds will do it for you. Background color doesn't matter at all. Okay, now I'm just going to create a bit of room for myself. And the first thing you need to do is create a new solid. Now the color doesn't really matter. So we're just going to call this one background and we're going to apply a gradient ramp to it. Now to do that, you just need to go over to your effects and presets panel and type in gradient ramp. I, however, have a plugin which allows me to do it from a shortcut. So if you ever see me do this, you just need to know that you go to your effects and presets panel and search for the effect there. This is called gradient ramp and I'm going to pop that on there. Now we're going to choose some nice background colors for this. The ones I chose were 292A2F and 1D1E21. Then we're going to bring our lighter color into the middle and our darker color to the top right corner. And then we're going to change from linear ramp to radial ramp. The next thing we do is increase the ramp scatter, and that sort of eases up these little lines you get on the background there. Maybe change that to 500. That smooths that out just a little bit. Okay, we are now pretty much done with that background, so we're just going to lock it off. The next thing to do is just create your one text layer. All of this is done with one text layer, which is really cool because it means you can go in, change that one text layer, and you don't need to worry about anything else. So we're going to call this one, I don't know, a glitchy boy. This one is a glitchy boy. We're going to bring our anchor point around. I'm just going to use this plugin here to click the center, but you can actually use the pan behind tool and you can just click and drag your center point around if you don't have the plugin. Okay, we're going to bring the size of this guy up like so, and we're just going to put him in the middle of our composition there. I'm just going to turn off night light as well. Sorry about that. In the center of our composition. Okay, I'm going to give this guy a bit more space, like so, and that looks good to me. Okay, so we have our text. We just need to learn how to offset the characters, glitch it up a little bit, and generally have some fun. So the first thing you're going to want to do is take a look at what your starting position is. Now, on here, I've got basically the text increased in its tracking, so there's more space between the characters. It offsets on its anchor point a little bit. You can see the characters jump around, but as they decrease, they come together and then they turn into the characters they need to be. Really simple. So what we need is a animation keyframe on our tracking. So you can click the little animate option down here, click tracking, and this gives you an animator with a range selector. Okay. What you need to do is basically increase the tracking amount to something that you're happy with, maybe around 20. That's quite a lot. And then go over to your range selector and keyframe end, move over, say 20 frames. And change the end keyframe to 0. And what this does is, over time, it takes your end amount from 100% to 0% and changes the amount of tracking to 20. Okay, so at first we want all of this to be stretched, and then we want them to slowly come back down to nothing. Maybe 20 is a little bit high. Maybe let's change that to 10. Okay, now let's just take a look at what we've already got over on our first text layer here. Okay, so if we hit U to bring that up, you can see that I've got a range selector that goes from 100 down to 0, and a character offset that goes from 20 down to 0, and then some opacity and some tracking amounts as well. So we're just going to put all of that in. We're going to take our tracking amount from 10 and bring it down here to 0. And what that does is it makes it more evenly spread. Okay, so if you look at how this decreases, it goes from right to left, but they shrink in as they come down. If you were to get rid of that, it goes from right to left, but they sort of shrink as they're moving. Doesn't look quite as glitchy. So I'm just going to put both of those in. We're then going to need opacity keyframe as well. So we'll hit T to bring up opacity, keyframe that, move along 20 frames with Control, Shift, and right, and then bring the opacity down to 0. If you press U, that brings up everything we've worked on so far, and you realize I've just made these opacities keyframes set off a little bit. So I'm going to hold Alt and then left, and I'm just going to push these back into position. Okay. The last thing that we need then, we have our opacity, we have our tracking amount, and we have our end animation. We just need to add in our character offset so that it doesn't offset the position of the characters, it offsets the character value, okay? So to do that, just make sure you've got your layer selected, twirl down so you have your animate option, and go to character offset. Now, it's important to make sure you've got nothing selected whenever you do this, because otherwise it will add another operator to the original animator that you've got here. What you want of these is separate animators, basically, okay? So your tracking amount and your end, they're going to be on the same thing, but your opacity and your character offset need to be different. So let's take our character offset here, add a keyframe, maybe push it up to 20. And you can see that that offsets each one of our characters by 20 characters according to the ASCII chart, okay? Doesn't really matter that you need to know that. You just need to know that you can increase or decrease this as you like. Move along 20 frames and take that character offset to 0. Now, if we press U again, that closes down everything that we've got, and we can take a look. Looks okay, apart from I did the opacity backwards because I'm dumb. So this second one needs to be 100 and the first one needs to be 0. And let's take another look. Okay, not too bad, looks all right so far, but we want it to come in a bit quicker than that. So let's select all of our keyframes and press F9. What that does is it eases them. And if I show you what that means, if I go to the graph editor, you should see a curve that looks like this. If you don't, it means you're on the wrong graph, you're on the value graph. If you see something that looks like an X, you need to be on the speed graph, which you can do by clicking the little menu down there. If you haven't eased these, okay, and they're just standard keyframes, then your graph will look very straight, okay? If you ease them, you're basically easing them in and easing them out, so your graph has a little bit of a hump to it. Goes from fast to slow, like that. Well, slow to fast to slow. If we now push this over by selecting the graph and pushing that yellow handle, it now goes from fast to slow, like that. Looks a little bit more glitchy. Okie dokie, we like that. Let's push this along a little bit more. Maybe give it an extra 10 frames for everything. Gives us a bit more breathing room whilst we're working. We can always shrink it later on. The next step to add in then, while we've got these, is these little boxes. And you can notice that our text sort of jumps and jiggles about a bit more, even when it's still wiggling. Now that is used doing a position wiggle, but we don't do it directly on the text. We do it on a null object that has some sliders applied to it. A little bit more involved, but it gives you a bit more control. So if you want it to just constantly glitch at the same rate, you can absolutely do that by just hitting P for bringing up position, Alt selecting the stopwatch and typing in wiggle, open brackets, and then the amount of wiggling that you want, say 50 pixels every 1 second, that's comma 1, close the brackets, and then you'll get a crazy amount. Oops, sorry, I've done that the wrong way. 50 wiggles per second. 50 wiggles a second at 1 pixel. So that should be the other way around. So if we did 1 and then 50, that would set it off a bit more. And it will go slower, but move around more, okay? So if you want that, you know, that's, well, a bit slow. So let's make that, you know, 10 times a second wiggle, 50 pixels. You can do that, it's super crazy, but you can't adjust it, okay? So I'm just gonna undo all of that and I'm gonna make this have a bit more control. What we need to do is bring in a null object. You can do that by going to Layer, New, Null. Okay, or you can press the shortcut Control-Shift-Alt-Y and that brings up a null object. Now a null object has no visuals, but it does allow you to pin things to it, which is what we're going to do now. You take your glitchy boy and you pick whip by clicking and dragging over to the null. Now you do this before anything else because at the moment the null isn't moving. And now what this means is whenever we move this null, okay, it moves the text with it as well, which is exactly what we want. So let's go to roughly so we can just see some text, okay? And now we need to add a couple of sliders. So I'm gonna bring up my shortcut, but of course you can go to the effects and presets panel, and I'm gonna create a slider control, okay? Now I'm gonna need 2 of these, so I'm gonna duplicate it, okay? And we'll come back to these in a second. The next thing to do is go to position of your null, so press P, and Alt click this. So you get a transform position. We are now going to type in wiggle, and just for a second, we're going to type 1, 1, and we're going to close it off, okay? We don't actually need that 1, 1. It's just there for reference. What I'm going to do now is rename these slider controls. I'm going to name the first one freak for frequency. So that's the amount of times it wiggles per second. And I'm going to name this one int for intensity, which is the intensity of the wiggle, how much it wiggles. Okay. We're then going to go down to where we've typed in our expression on wiggle here. and we have to define these as variables now. Doesn't matter if you know what that means, just makes sense to understand that you need to tell it what this is. You need to tell it what frequency is. So when I type the word frequency, I want to adjust the frequency. I need to assign that to something that is a control. Okay, so I'm going to take the pick whip from frequency and I'm going to pick whip it to the slider control for freak. So all we typed in there was freq equals, and then we pick whipped to the slider control. We need to close this line off with a semicolon to tell the computer that's an end of a line of code. And we need to do the same thing again for intensity. int, now capitalization is important. int equals, and then we're going to pick whip over here to the intensity slider. Close that off with a semicolon, okay? And the next thing we need to do is just go to our wiggle 1, and instead of 1, we're going to type in frequency and intensity. Now what this means is the wiggle is tied directly to the values of the frequency and intensity slider. So if we click off this, we shouldn't get any errors, but we'd also see that it doesn't actually wiggle at all. So it looks like we haven't done anything. However, if I were to increase these slider amounts, you'd notice that it's going absolutely crazy. Okay, so let's give these an initial value of say 20 each, and I'll just quickly check what I did on the other one so it doesn't look too different. I think I did 25 and 25. So let's do 25 and 25. So at this point in time, when we keyframe these at the beginning, okay, it's going to have a frequency and intensity of 25. 25 times a second is going to wiggle 25 pixels. If we move along 30 frames to bring it in line with the rest of our keyframes here, okay, we can then bring those sliders down to 0. Now, I'm not going to go quite to 0 because I still want it to wiggle just a little bit when it's settled. So I'm going to bring them both down to 4 and see what that looks like. So maybe a bit quicker than that. So we're going to have 10 maybe on the frequency. Make sure that I'm aligned over that keyframe there. Otherwise it creates an erroneous one that we don't need. Maybe 10 on the frequency, 4 on the intensity. Bit too much, maybe 10 on the frequency and 2 on the intensity. So that's like wiggling a small amount in place. Okay, happy with that. Let's take all of these keyframes then. F9 to give them easy ease. Go to our graph editor and just drag this along just a little bit, like so, to make it go fast to slow. And let's take a look at what we got. All right, not too bad. Happy with that. It's coming in and it's being a glitchy boy. In fact, let's push this back up to 4. I like the fact it was freaking out a bit more. Yeah, I like that. Okay, so we are now pretty much done with this text layer. We're going to come back to it later when we want this to break up. But for now, we're done. All we need to do now is work with some good adjustment layers. Okay, so I'm going to go just to where the text starts to fade in here. Maybe call it 5 frames. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. And I'm going to create a new adjustment layer. You can do that with layer, new, and adjustment layer, or Control-Alt-Y. What an adjustment layer does is it affects everything underneath it. Okay, so I'm going to start naming my layers now. I'm going to call this one Wiggle, Wiggle Me, and I'm going to call this one Glitch 1. Okay. Now, we could, if we wanted to scale this text up, we could just duplicate this text, scale it up, offset it a little bit, and it looks a little bit glitchy. Yeah. However, this means that when we want to change this text, we're going to have to come through and change each one of those individual layers every time. And that's not what we're about. Okay, we want to do it nice and easy. So we take our glitch 1 adjustment layer and we go to our effects and presets and we apply an effect called magnify. What this does is it acts like a magnification glass. Okay, if I change the shape from circle to square, and I'll just quickly change the blending mode to something so you can see exactly what it's doing. Everywhere inside of this area, it's going to magnify anything underneath it by the values that we give it. So if we crank this magnification way up, you can see that there's an S in there that's expanded a bit more. If I crank the size up, it's going to affect more and more of our text. Okay, so I'm going to quickly turn this back to normal so you can see what I'm doing a little bit. Okay, I'm going to decrease the magnification, maybe decrease the size, and I'm going to offset it to a point where I'm happy with what it looks like. Okay, maybe like that. Now, because this is an adjustment layer, right, it is affecting everything. This is why we've got that little box there, because it's affecting the gradient on the background. Now, that's intentional. That's what I want. But if you don't want it to affect the background, it's really easy to do. All you've got to do is just pre-compose everything you're going to make from now on into a composition by itself, and then the adjustment layer won't affect the background underneath it. However, I kind of like the fact that it affects the background, so we're going to keep it. However, we don't want this to be on all the time, because if it's on all the time, it's going to look like this. Okay? And it messes with our text. We only want it to be on for a short amount of time. So I'm going to cut this layer with Alt open square bracket, and that cuts to the point where the cursor is. I'm going to move over maybe 2 frames and cut again with Alt close square bracket. Now that actually gives us 3 frames where it's on, because it gives you 1 as you're cutting off. Now if we look at this, okay, you can see that it sort of zooms in just briefly and then comes off again, like that. Not too bad. Oops. However, not too exciting. I want it to sort of affect the background a bit more. So I'm going to play with the blending mode. I'm going to come down here and choose soft light. And what that does is it basically allows anything light to shine through. So we get the light layers from the original text and the light layers on the zoom text, and it darkens the background up as well. Now we've done all the hard work. The rest is just duplicating and offsetting so that we can get a cool looking text effect. Let's duplicate this glitch with Control D. Oops, excuse me, I wasn't selected on the layer there, I was selected in the effects panel. So you need to select the layer, duplicate with Control D. It'll automatically name it glitch 2 for you, which is nice and useful. Then if you just press open square bracket, you'll notice it pushes the start of the layer to wherever the cursor is. So essentially line up your cursor to wherever you want it to be, and open square bracket to push that start of the layer along. Now at the moment it's exactly the same, but we don't need to create everything new again. All we need to do is change a few of the settings. We can offset, for example, bring it down here. I might increase the size, decrease the zoom a touch, maybe change it from soft light to lighten, maybe from soft light to darken. You don't know, that's just going to remove the light text. Let's try overlay. No, that looks too similar. Let's leave it on lighten for now, so that it just duplicates the text and we get a little bit of box around there as well. I don't want this one to be on quite as long, so I'm just going to move along like so and cut that layer off. And then I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to duplicate the layer. I'm going to maybe leave a gap this time of say 1 frame, and I'm going to bring that layer across with open square bracket. I'm going to drag this out so it's here a bit longer. And this time I'm going to choose normal. Maybe not normal, maybe add. Add looks good. Let's have add. Let's have it be quite a small size, but a really massive magnification. And then we'll just offset this so it's sort of in the middle a little bit, like so. Maybe give it a bit more breathing room. And let's see what we've got. There we go, not too bad. I think it is a bit too slow actually, so I'm going to grab all these previous keyframes, I'm going to shift them back 10 frames with Alt, Shift and Left. That just makes everything happen just a little bit quicker, so it settles a little bit quicker as well. Nice. I think one more little glitch as we close off, and that'll look quite good. Let's see what we did on this other one. We had sort of 3 and then a gap, and then there's 1 here as well, which was just a sort of smaller one. Let's do that then. Let's have another last one, which is quite small. I'm going to duplicate the first layer because that's closest to what I want. And I'm going to push it to the end. And then I'm going to just mess around a little bit with what we've got going on. Let's try, what's color dodge? That looks okay. Color burn? Nah, that doesn't look any good. Let's try screen. And let's reduce the opacity just a little bit. Now let's take the size and bring it down. Or do we bring it up? But decrease the magnification. Let's do that and let's glitch it off a little bit. So you can see, for example, that this is really just trial and error. You can do whatever you want for this bit. If you think it looks good, then it looks good. I'm happy with that. Okie dokie. The next thing to do then is to have this text animate off the screen. As you can see, we've got in our previous one here. We've got our bits that come in and flash about. It wiggles for a while so they can read it. And we've got a succession of keyframes here that just disengage the text, and then the next bit starts in by itself. Disengaging this text is really, really easy. Okay, so we go along to what we want. Glitches in, glitchy boy, maybe give him, that's enough time to read it. Let's put it on 2 seconds though, just to be safe. We now need to keyframe pretty much everything we've got down here, everything that we want to adjust, but we're done with the wiggle and we're done with the other adjustment layers for now. So let's take these exact keyframes, the same ones here, and let's move along 1 frame with just Control and right. Okay, now adjust as you like, because there's only 1 frame in between them. They're going to sort of hold, yeah, because there's only 1 frame of difference. They're going to glitch between it. If you want a bigger gap than 1, I'll show you how to do that in a minute. So let's take the range selector then and let's start pushing it back up a bit, push the tracking amount up a bit. We can even turn it backwards if you'd like. That might look quite cool. I didn't do that last time. Let's take the character offset. Let's take the opacity. Yeah, that is quite cool. Let's take that. All right. Move on another frame. We can take all of this here. Let's change the tracking amount to a positive. Maybe this much. Let's take tracking all of it. Let's offset the characters the other way a bit, just so we've got a bit more. Oh, it's a glitchy boy. And let's increase the opacity quite a bit. And let's do one more frame with quite a low opacity. And let's bring in the character offset again and the tracking amount again, back down a bit. Now, one thing I did do in this one, which I've just remembered, is I also done this bit where the text jumps up and jumps down, which I haven't actually done in this version, but that is the beauty of doing it with live text. We can add that in without too much trouble, okay? All you need to do that is go back to your first set of keyframes, go to animate, making sure you've got nothing selected, and you can change the anchor point. Let's go down to the anchor point here. Let's add a range selector as well, and put the anchor point up to, let's say 20. That seems about right. So now, if everything is deselected, okay, so if the end is at 0, then nothing is going to be offset. And if the end is at 100, then everything's going to be offset by 20 pixels. So let's have it at 100 here and press U to collapse what we don't need. Let's go down to here and let's have the range selector go down to 0, okay? Let's grab both of those keyframes, hit F9, go to our easy ease graph and bring them in. So you can see it's really easy to go back and add in extra stuff that we didn't do before. Now we've got a bit more of a glitch to it. Looks not too shabby. And what this means is when this breaks up, we can really start to play around with it, okay? So let's go to our first keyframe on the disengage. Let's take our range selector and let's give it a keyframe of 0, which is the same as the keyframe here. Let's move along one frame. And let's give it a range maybe of 37. Move along one frame, give it a bit of a larger range, maybe a bit of a lower one, who knows. Go along here, pretty much offset everything apart from the last couple, okay? This range selector needs one final keyframe as well over here. So let's change the tracking so that the last bunch of letters are clumped together. And now we can cut off both our wiggle layer and our text layer with Alt close square bracket, okay? And now that's gonna make this text disappear straight after it glitches out. So let's have a look. Got to render a little bit. Now we've added a few things. Doesn't look too bad. That's way too long though. And the offset is incorrect. The character offset here needs to be 0. So it actually says a glitchy boy. And then the character offset here needs to be a 0 as well. There we go. So here we go, glitchy boy. Oops, I just changed all of those, which was a bit silly of me. We need to make this one 162, this one 0, and this first one 0. So lots of character offset, down to no character offset, stays at no character offset, and then glitches out again. Let's shift these forward 20 frames. Let's go to the end keyframe here, and we can then cut both of these layers with Alt and close square bracket. Gives us less time to read it, but there's not much there. Bloop, bloop. Looks good to me. All right. So the last thing to do then is just to quickly add this sort of, if you want it, this sort of old CRT television-y effect. It's quite simple, the way to do it. There was also some audio as well, but you guys can find a glitch effect audio anywhere you like. So let's add those last two elements in then, and then we can duplicate our text and change it and show you how easy it is. Last thing to do, layer, new adjustment layer. We're going to call this one CRT, and we're going to make it last the entire length of our composition, okay? On here, we need to go to our effects and presets and add a Venetian blinds, okay? Leave the direction where it is. Transition completion, let's change that to 50. Now what that does is it basically creates some little stripes that come down the screen that you can open or close, okay? We want to leave them at 50, and because it's meant to be an old sort of crappy looking telly, we can increase the feather, which is the blur along the edge of these lines, to about 4, and that just gives them a little bit of blurriness on the end there. If I turn that back to 0, you can see what I mean, okay? Now we want these to sort of fluctuate just a little bit, but not so much that it needs a wiggle. So we can just sort of turn on here, come up to maybe 12 on this keyframe. Okay, bring it back down to maybe 4 there. Maybe quickly make it really crisp at 0. Quickly bring it back up to 4 again. You know, bring it up to 12 again here, and then bring it back down to 4 so that we can have it looping seamlessly. Okay, from there, we can pretty much leave that as it is. Okay, the only thing is you probably don't want it super black like that. So what we need to do is just drop the opacity down. Let's maybe have it 25%. Maybe that's still a bit much. Let's maybe have it 15%. Yeah, that looks good. Okay, that's pretty much it. There's just one more thing I did, which was add this sort of cloudy glitching you might be able to see just randomly throughout. That basically looks like a little bit of snow, a little bit of static on the television. That's really easy to do as well. So let's go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and we'll call this one Static. And on this one, we need to add an effect called Fractal Noise. And what this does is it creates a sort of bump map from completely white to completely dark in a sort of clouded kind of texture. We can make the noise any way you want. You can have it sort of maximum, you can have it smeary, you can have it all sorts of things. We can probably leave it on basic, to be honest. Let's increase the complexity just a little bit though. And let's make the contrast just up a little bit more, like so. And what you need to do now is just basically change the evolution so that it doesn't have the same sort of texture whenever it flashes in. So let's go to the start of our keyframe, start of our composition here, and add a keyframe on evolution. Let's go to wherever we decided the end of our composition is going to be, which I think was at the end of this Venetian blinds. And let's add a evolution where it's gone round twice. And all that means is if we scrub along, it's going to change a little bit. Again, you don't want this fully opaque. So let's see if choosing a blending mode helps. Maybe something like screen or soft light, maybe lighten, maybe multiply. Let's leave it on lighten, okay? And let's drop the opacity down to 0. This one, really easy. Alt-click opacity and choose wiggle again. This time it's a nice simple wiggle. We want it to wiggle maybe every second to 50% maximum capacity. See what that looks like. So it's going to come up. No, we want it to be much quicker than that. Let's see what the other one was. I can't quite remember what I did before. I called it fog, first of all. We did wiggle 1550. So 15 times a second, it can go from anywhere between 0 and 50% opacity. And let's take a look at what we've got. There it goes. It's sort of flashing in, rendering a bit. It's a bit much for me, to be honest. Let's find its brightest point. And let's change this down to something like multiply or add or color dodge. Color dodge looks okay. Oh, decrease the overall capacity. Let's leave it on multiply. Let's leave it on multiply at 100%. It's a little bit more subtle and it sort of glitches out just a little bit more as well. Yeah. Let's change that down to 50 there as well. Okie dokie, happy with that. So we've got our static, we've got our CRT, and we've got our first bunch of text. In order to change what that says, it's really easy. You duplicate everything with Control D. You press Control, open square bracket, that will push the layers above everything, okay? And then you can go to where your text disappears, which is right about here, and you can bring that next layer across like so. You can then find a point where all your effects have stopped for a while so you can see what it says, and you can just select that layer, double click, and change it to a glitchy boy, and change it to a second glitchy boy. And voila, we are done. Let's cap that off, say here, trim that composition, and take a look at what we've made. Okay, not too bad. Now, obviously, everything we've done here is going to be exactly the same. Where it's got some different text, okay, it's going to look slightly different, sure, but all of our adjustment layers here are the same. But because, oh, that's my cat in the background there getting some food. You might have heard that. Now, because these are adjustment layers, you don't need to recreate them. All you need to do is come in like you did before and just change them up a little bit. Maybe increase the size of this one, maybe push this one over so it's later a frame, and then shift it across so that only the first half is duplicated. Do the same here, maybe increase the size a bit, push it down so it's cutting off a bit of the layers. Get this last one, bring that over and down a bit, like so. And there you go. You've now got a completely new glitch effect. So it's really easy to duplicate, really easy to change around, switch up. It's a really, really cool effect. And that's sort of the power of using live adjustment layers as opposed to hard baking everything. So I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, let me know. I can do more of this sort of thing. Oh, of course, one last thing is if you wanted to change how this second one disappears, you can, of course, adjust all of these keyframes here as well. But where there's already different text, it's going to have different effects, different tracking it's going to look like because there's more text, different character offsets because they're different original characters. So you don't really need to play around with this, but you can if you want to. But that is it. Thank you very much for watching, everybody. Hope you enjoyed this. If you did, let me know. If you didn't, also let me know. And hopefully I'll do better next time. Until then, though, I'll catch you all next time on TipTut.
Remember to subscribe for more tips, tricks, and tutorials. Thanks for watching.